I'm Ryan Getty, and this is the French Revolution Political Compass. I'm going to be talking about the different personalities, factions, and ideological currents that powered the French Revolution, one of the most important political events of the last several hundred years. On the x-axis of the political compass, we have the French tricolor on the left side, which represents French republicanism. No, not that kind of republicanism. Republicanism as in wanting a French republic as opposed to the Ancien Regime. The Ancien Regime, or the old regime, is what we call the regime that existed before the French Revolution, the king, that kind of thing. People who are less inclined to republicanism are on the right side of this chart and are represented by this fleur-de-lis flag, which was a symbol of the French monarchy at the time. On the y-axis of the political compass, we have a guillotine. This roughly corresponds to willingness to utilize political violence inside France. So people closer to the top of the political compass are more comfortable with things like the Reign of Terror or supporting an invasion of France to crush the revolution, for example. Whereas people closer to the bottom of this chart are less into that sort of thing. Now, the people at the bottom of the chart weren't necessarily pacifists or anything like that. In fact, some of the people down here thought that the French army was going to be welcomed as an army of liberators as it marched across Europe to freedom to spread the revolution. But just put that aside for now, we'll get there. Just try and treat the y-axis as the comfortable with internal violence spectrum rather than violence in general. It was a revolution, after all. Not every important person in the revolution is represented on this chart. I picked people for the chart based on how well I thought they represented something unique or interesting worth talking about. Oh, and this chart was originally created for a stream that I did with Dreg. And,
Okay.
he would print like denunciations in the newspaper.
Like people that should be killed?
Yes.
Whoa.
And that's actually... Felt like I should mention that, especially since this was the top comment on my last video. Go check out his channel if you've never seen it before. Okay, so without further ado, let's start in the bottom right of this chart with this cartoon, which I'm intending to essentially represent the establishment of the Ancien Regime before the revolution. This is a good place to start, I think, because by talking about what was going on with the old establishment, we can figure out why everyone else is where they are on this chart. What we have here is a clergyman and a noble riding on the back of a common man. This represents essentially accurately, in my opinion, if you'll allow me to insert a little bias, the situation in France around the time of the Revolution. If you know anything about the French Revolution already, you might know that French society was divided into estates. The clergy was the first estate, the nobility was the second estate, and the third estate was everyone else. About 97% of the population of France was part of the third estate, from small business owners to professionals like lawyers to literal peasants. All of these people were part of the third estate. A great way to illustrate the unequal burdens on the estates is with taxes. In modern developed countries, it's common for people that are wealthier to pay higher rates of taxes than the poor. Things kind of worked exactly the opposite way in pre-revolutionary France. The first and second estates had all sorts of exemptions from taxation. The lives of the nobles and the clergy were often directly funded by taxes and various fees paid by the third estate. So this is the system we're headed into the French Revolution with. In addition to being very unequal, the Ancien Regime was also very institutionally conservative and resistant to change. One of the big problems that France faced at this time was a debt crisis. The French government had recently spent a whole lot of money on a lot of things, but one of the big ones was financing a revolt by some colonial backwater against France's eternal enemy, the British. There were multiple attempts to make France's public financing system make some more sense, but the first and second estates basically resisted anything that would require them to pay more money. A guy called Turgot wanted to do a tax on land value. This was rejected because the clergy and the nobles, of course, owned a lot of land. The land value tax supporters in my audience, I'm sure, are already rushing to type a comment about Henry George, but I digress. A guy called Cologne also tried to reform taxes. The establishment, again, resisted reform through an institution called the Parlement. The debt crisis continued, which led to the calling of a very important meeting of all the estates of France, where hopefully all of French society could come together and figure out how to get out of this mess. This meeting was called the Estates General. The old establishment of the Ancien Regime is in the bottom right-hand corner of this chart because their defining characteristic to me is their refusal to do basically anything. They basically just wanted to preserve the way things were because they were doing pretty well, even as the state was in massive debt and the common people were bearing most of the cost. Now that we have some background, let's move on to our first actual person on the chart, a man named Emmanuel Joseph Siyes, more commonly known as the Abbe Siyes. He was one of the most important players at a bunch of different points during the revolution. By talking about his life, we can really trace the course of how the whole revolution went. Abbe Siyes, as you might have guessed from the title, was a clergyman, a member of the First Estate. Despite this, he was a very important voice for the Third Estate. Leading up to the Estates General, he wrote a really influential pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? Here's how it opens. The plan of this work is quite simple. There are 3 questions that we have to ask ourselves. 1, what is the Third Estate? Everything. 2, what until now has it been in the existing political order? Nothing. 3, what does it want to be? Something. Abbe Siyes thought that the Third Estate was the French nation and wanted a constitution that recognized this. At the Estates General, when it became clear that the first 2 estates were going to unite to make decisions at the expense of the Third Estate, Siyes made a motion at a meeting of the Third Estate for the Third Estate to declare itself the National Assembly. Just after this, the Third Estate delegates were locked out of their usual meeting place and instead used an empty tennis court to meet. Inside the tennis court, representatives of the Third Estate, as well as some liberal members of other estates like the Comte de Mirabeau, another important figure in the revolution, took an oath to not stop meeting until a constitution had been written for France. When the king tried to dissolve the new National Assembly, Mirabeau said to the envoy who came to tell the assembly to pack it up that we are here by the will of the people and will only leave by the force of bayonets, just to give you some context for how high tensions were at this point. But back to Abbe Siyes. Abbe Siyes was an advocate for constitutional monarchy, but when the king was on trial, he voted for death. He withdrew from politics when the Reign of Terror was launched and returned to politics after Robespierre was executed. Abbe Siyes was also instrumental in organizing the coup that brought Napoleon to power. His most famous quote really emphasizes his reputation as a political survivor. When asked what he did during the Reign of Terror, he just said, I lived. This is why I've got him basically center on this chart. I'd have him more towards the center if I could avoid overlapping the pictures too much. He died at the age of 88 of natural causes. Next up on the chart, as we round out this area, is Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans. You're just gonna have to forgive my pronunciation throughout this video. He was one of the richest people in France and also a cousin of King Louis XVI. Louis Philippe, not to be confused with his son, also called Louis Philippe, who would be king in 1830 after a different revolution, was one of those liberal nobles that I mentioned earlier. He was a supporter of constitutional monarchy rather than the more absolutist kind of monarchy that France had at the time. He opened up his palace in Paris to people of all classes and basically provided a venue for revolutionary organizing because he didn't allow the police to come onto his property. During the revolution, he changed his name to Phillipe Egalite to signal his commitment to revolutionary ideals. According to royalists, he funded the famous Women's March on Versailles, and lots of the king's allies thought that what Philippe was really after was a chance at becoming that kind of more constitutional monarch. Phillipe Egalite shocked everyone by voting for the death of his cousin, the king, at trial. Unfortunately for Mr. Egalite, this did not stop him from coming under suspicion after his son, who was an officer in the Revolutionary Army, fled France and was implicated in a coup plot. Phillipe Egalite fell under suspicion and he was executed by guillotine in 1793. I found 2 potential last words for him. Either "they applauded me," allegedly said to the crowd on his way to the guillotine, or "get on with it" to the executioner. Next to Phillipe Egalite, basically dead center on this chart, we have the worldwide revolutionary, hero of 2 worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette. If you're an American, you may know Lafayette from the American Revolution. He was a French noble who believed in Enlightenment ideals so much that he came over to help the colonies win independence from the British. Back in France, he was also a staunch advocate for Enlightenment liberal ideals, and he was also a hero for his exploits during the American Revolution. He was very important in the early French Revolution. He, with the help of Thomas Jefferson, wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was very much influenced by the Enlightenment ideals of natural human rights, a social contract, and philosophers like Rousseau and Locke. On July 14th, 1789, the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a famous prison used to hold political prisoners, basically, but it also had an armory that revolutionaries wanted to get their hands on. So storming the Bastille had the dual effect of toppling a symbol of tyranny and of acquiring gunpowder. By the way, the storming of the Bastille is commemorated every year in France. Here's a picture of me in Paris on Bastille Day a few years ago. Lafayette, with his military experience and unimpeachable revolutionary credentials, was put in charge of the National Guard, the pseudo-military police force that was intended to maintain order in Paris and protect the revolutionary government the day after the storming of the Bastille. Lafayette also invented the first French tricolor cockade for the National Guard by adding the royal color of white to the traditional colors of Paris, red and blue. This cockade is what the French tricolor flag is based on. Lafayette also believed in constitutional monarchy and was a member of groups dedicated to constitutional monarchy as a goal, like the Society of 1789. Lafayette's fortunes in the Revolution began to turn when he continued being a defender of the idea of constitutional monarchy after the king and queen tried to flee France in an event known as the Flight to Paris. We'll talk more about why this freaked out the revolutionaries so much later, but basically they were worried, and not totally without cause, that if the king and queen managed to escape France, they would come back with an army to crush the revolution. It also didn't help the king's case that he left a letter behind talking about how horrible the revolution had been and how he was the rightful father protector of the people. The Flight to Paris was a key turning point in the French Revolution, and pretty soon, people were marching, demanding not just a constitutional monarchy, but the removal of the king altogether, a republic. Lafayette, in charge of defending the government, which had just declared that the king would stay king a few days before, brought his National Guard to bear against one of these marches against the king on the Champ de Mars. The National Guard ended up firing into the crowd and killed dozens of people. This basically destroyed Lafayette's reputation for the rest of the revolution. Lafayette was later a general in the Revolutionary Army, but he criticized the growing radicalism in Paris and eventually fled France before being captured by the Austrians, who the French were at war with at this point, in the Netherlands. He was a prisoner for years, and he came back to France after the revolution. He died in 1834 at 78 years old. Okay, let's move on to some real reactionaries now, starting with the royal couple, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The king, Louis XVI, was not a very good king. He was also never really supposed to be king. He was only made heir after his brother and his father died ahead of him. At every turn, Louis was forced to accept the revolution, even though he clearly hated it. Back in the early days of the revolution, constitutional monarchy was still on the table, and the people were pretty eager for Louis to get on board with this plan. When the women of Paris initiated the March on Versailles with the aim of securing access to food and forcing the royal couple to move to Paris to live among the people, so to speak, Lafayette appeared on the balcony of the palace with the king. To everyone's surprise, the crowd shouted, "Long live the king." But the king would very quickly lose whatever favor he had gained with the people when it became clear that he was going to resist the revolution, doing things like vetoing laws popular with the lower classes of Paris. Even as late as 1792, though, when the people of Paris broke into the palace where Louis was staying, they didn't kill him. They forced him to wear the Phrygian cap, the bonnet rouge, a symbol of the revolution, and had him drink a toast to the nation. By this point, Louis was not long for this world, and momentum had already probably irreversibly turned against the monarchy since Louis had already tried to flee the country a year earlier. But the fact that this was the reaction of a mob, making him declare allegiance to the revolution, basically, when by this point the people of Paris had already demonstrated how much they loved gratuitous violence, I think shows that at one point Louis absolutely could have made the whole constitutional monarch thing happen. But he didn't, obviously. Louis's days were really numbered when, in response to Louis vetoing legislation, dismissing ministers, and the armies at war with France threatening collective punishment on Paris if the king was harmed, the Tuileries Palace, where Louis was staying at the time, was stormed again by revolutionaries. By the way, among those storming the palace were soldiers called fédérés from Marseille. When these soldiers were entering Paris about a month earlier, they were singing this song. This is today the national anthem of France. But anyway, fighting broke out between the king's guards and the soldiers, and the king was forced to flee. He gave himself up to the protection of the National Assembly, and he was arrested. Later, documents were found inside the palace that detailed the attempts that the king had made to subvert the revolution, from trying to entice foreign armies and nobles that had fled the country to invade, to declarations that he hated the revolution. At this point, the king was put on trial, convicted of treason, and of course, guillotined. His last words were reportedly, "I die innocent, I pardon my enemies, and I hope that my blood will be useful to the French, that it will appease God's anger." He continued talking, but we don't really know how that ended because the drums began to roll. Moving on to the Queen. As a brief aside, I really don't like a lot of the history that I've read about Marie Antoinette. The monarchists basically treat her like an innocent child with no agency and no influence on anything, and the revolutionaries just basically spend all their energy lying about her. Because of this, it can sometimes be difficult to determine fact from fiction. She really was made into a living devil by the revolutionaries. I'd encourage you to read some of the ridiculous things that they were accusing her of at the time. I want to focus on what I see as the truth of Marie Antoinette, and what is certainly true about her is that she was against the revolution and against it pretty ardently. She was pretty consistently trying to push the king in a more conservative direction and wanted France to declare war on the other powers in Europe so that way they would have a reason to invade and put the monarchy back in charge. She tried to get the Austrians, led by her brother Leopold II, to invade France on behalf of the monarchy and crush the revolution directly. She also sent French military plans to the Austrians. She herself was Austrian, if that wasn't clear already. Here's a section from a letter she wrote to her brother Leopold II. She did live an extravagant lifestyle, and she was made into a symbol of how France was impoverishing the people to spend money on the aristocrats. But she also probably never said, "let them eat cake." That was a phrase that was used long before the French Revolution. After the king was executed, the queen wasn't far behind because, of course, her real crime wasn't so much the things that she had been convicted of necessarily, but being on the losing side of a revolution. If she were in charge, I think there's a reasonable shot that the revolution gets crushed. Back in 1789, she seems much more decisive than her husband. She was given a show trial and then guillotined. Her last words were apologizing for stepping on the foot of her executioner. Let's talk about Marie Antoinette's brother for a second. Leopold II, the Holy Roman Emperor, as well as Frederick William II, the King of Prussia. They're peeking over the top of the compass because they were not in France, but they were very concerned about what was happening in France, along with a lot of the other monarchs in Europe. The monarchs of Europe during the French Revolution were concerned for the French monarchy and concerned that the revolution might spread to their territory. The Prussians and the Austrians, working with French emigres, French nobles who had fled France basically to try and regroup and gather forces to invade and crush the revolution, issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. The Declaration of Pillnitz was a joint statement by Prussia and Austria that they would intervene if the revolutionaries threatened the monarchy of France. I think it's debated just how serious of a threat this was actually at the time, but if it was intended to just be a threat to get the revolutionaries to calm down, it absolutely backfired. The declaration had the effect of totally freaking out the revolutionaries, swaying public opinion against the monarchy, and pretty soon France was actually declaring war on Austria rather than the other way around. The war was being supported by a lot of the revolutionaries who were filled with zeal and ready for the people to welcome them as liberators as they smashed crowns all across Europe, and also by the King and Queen of France, who, as we've already discussed, thought the war might be their ticket back to the top. You might think that this would be it for the revolution, since French society was in disarray and a ton of military officers had fled the country since they were nobles. But France actually did very well, all things considered, thanks in no small part to revolutionary France basically inventing modern conscription. France conquered, liberated some territory and established satellite states, sister republics, outside of France's borders. Since we're already talking about the wars, let me spend some time talking about the French emigres represented by this man on horseback here. We've already discussed the emigres a little bit, so this won't be an incredibly long piece, but it's worth discussing who they were in a little more depth. There were average people who left France because they feared persecution by the revolutionary governments. These people were also emigres, but what I'm talking about here are the aristocratic emigres who left France in order to consolidate forces against the revolution. As we've already discussed, they worked to gain support for the Ancien Regime from the Holy Roman Emperor and also the King of Prussia. They formed armies led by various aristocrats and joined forces with the coalition of monarchist states that were taking on the revolution. One element about the French Revolution that's often forgotten, since people mostly just talk about the Reign of Terror, is just how bloody things got outside of Paris. In the top right-hand corner of the chart, we have the Catholic and Royal Army of the Vendee region of France. The Vendee was a conservative part of France. They were highly Catholic, and they very much did not appreciate the anti-clerical actions of the French Republic, like forcing Catholic priests to swear an oath to the nation and confiscating church lands. Conscription by the French government to go fight for this new regime that was doing all these things that the people of the Vendee absolutely hated was also, as you can imagine, unpopular. The revolutionary government saw this as an existential threat, and in one of the most brutal moments from the French Revolution, created the infernal columns, which basically roamed through the Vendee, exterminating suspected counter-revolutionary elements of the population. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 17,000 people were sentenced to death during the Reign of Terror, and about 10,000 more died in jail. The estimates I've seen for the war in the Vendee place the death toll easily over 100,000. The war in the Vendee, frankly, makes the Reign of Terror look like nothing. The last group of reactionaries on our chart here, I think, are some of the most inherently comical characters from the French Revolution, and I think it goes to show that the French Revolution wasn't universally accepted, even in Paris. I'm talking about the Muscadin youth. After the Reign of Terror came to an end with Robespierre's overthrow, a subculture sprang up of young people who would dress in fancy clothes and basically fight former revolutionaries on the streets of Paris. They're part of what's known as the White Terror, where Jacobins and their supporters were persecuted after the revolutionary Reign of Terror ended. Okay, we've talked a lot about the more conservative side of the French Revolution. Now let's talk about the men and women who hated most of the people that we just spent all that time learning about and wanted to build a new France on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. We're going to start in the bottom left-hand corner. Things should move a little quicker now since we covered a lot of the background whenever we were talking about the conservatives. First, I want to talk about Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Brissot was a really interesting guy. Before we get to his other politics, I should mention that he founded the anti-slavery organization, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. Slavery was practiced at this time of the revolution in the French colonies. Brissot was a leader of the Girondin faction in the revolutionary government, which at the beginning of the revolution made him pretty radical. Girondins like Brissot were part of the Jacobin Club. They were called Girondins because many of their key leaders were from around the area of Gironde. Brissot was one of the ringleaders at that protest for the removal of the king that we talked about earlier, the one that led to the massacre on the Champ de Mars. They also tended to want a more decentralized government, where the regional governments would have a little more power, as opposed to Robespierre's faction that wanted a more centralized France. He was also an advocate for declaring war on the other powers of Europe in order to spread the revolution. This really put him at odds with Robespierre and his allies from the Mountain. Robespierre and his allies were called the Mountain because they sat on the highest levels in the assembly. Just as an aside, if you think about it, the French revolutionary assemblies and conventions were sort of the first political compass. You may already know that we got left and right from the French Revolution, since in the early days, the constitutional monarchists and the Republicans sat on the left and the defenders of the Ancien Regime sat on the right. But now we have a vertical dimension, with the radical Mountain of Robespierre being at the top and the more moderate members of the convention sitting closer to the bottom. It really does start to look like a kind of rudimentary political compass. But anyway, back to Brissot. Brissot and Robespierre were always feuding for power, and when in the early days of the war with Austria and Prussia, things didn't look like they were going so well for the French, this really hurt the popularity of the Girondins, since they were the ones in power at this time and had been pushing for war. Brissot and the Girondins generally believed in a republic. They also voted against executing the king, which opened them up to accusations of being royalists by more radical politicians. The Girondins were also much less in touch with the Sans-Culottes. That's a term you're going to be hearing a lot on this side of the political compass. We'll talk more about them later, but they were basically working class Parisian radicals. Brissot and the Girondins were much less willing to channel the desires and cater to the needs of the people of Paris, which gave Robespierre the opportunity to strike and seize power for the Mountain. A popular uprising in Paris with the support of the Mountain and the government of Paris managed to get the Girondins expelled from government. Brissot, along with many of the Girondins, was eventually arrested, found guilty by the Revolutionary Tribunal that was now out of their control and in the control of the Mountain, and he was guillotined in October 1793. Brissot and the Girondins that were executed together sang La Marseillaise on their way to the guillotine. Brissot's last words were, "Rather death than slavery." This is the motto of the French. Let's cover some more people affiliated with the Girondin faction. Next to Brissot, we have Madame Roland. She was an intellectual and writer, but I think her most interesting contribution to the Revolutionary era was with a salon she ran, which became an important meeting place for the Girondins, especially during the French Revolution. Though there were some gains for women's rights during the Revolution, and they did have political impact, like with the Women's March on Versailles, for example, women could not vote or hold political office. Since this was the environment at the time for women, Madame Roland's salon was a pretty interesting expression of political influence, I think. Of course, though, she was a Girondin, and so when the Girondins were purged, she was arrested and sent to the guillotine. She had some of my favorite last words in the French Revolution. She said, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" Since we're talking about women's rights, I want to talk about another influential woman in the French Revolution, also aligned with the Girondin faction, Olympe de Gouges. Do you remember the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen? Well, Olympe de Gouges' most notable contribution to the French Revolution was the pamphlet, The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. In it, she advocated equal rights for women and for children born out of wedlock. She was also critical of the Reign of Terror and of the political violence that came to dominate the revolution. This, combined with the fact that she was aligned with the rest of the Girondins, pretty much guaranteed that she would face the guillotine. Her last words were, "Children of the homeland, avenge my death." Moving on to our last Girondin, we have an American, another worldwide revolutionary, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, by the time he got to France, was already somewhat of a celebrity. His work in the American Revolution was known, and he had just been basically kicked out of England for writing a book called Rights of Man in 1791, defending the French Revolution. He was elected to the National Convention in France, despite the fact that he really couldn't speak French. His revolutionary credibility was just that good. Paine in the American Revolution wrote that of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. So he was pretty happy to see the king removed from power, but he also didn't want the king to be executed, and he tried to stop it from happening. He actually wasn't executed like the rest of the Girondins, but he was thrown in jail. This was basically the end of his French Revolution career. His reputation as a radical and as an opponent of organized religion meant that when he returned to America, he did not receive a warm welcome. Only 6 people went to his funeral when he died. Thomas Paine is my favorite American founding father, and one day I'd like to do a whole video about his life, hopefully, maybe. Speaking of this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment letting me know who you like from this chart. Okay, back to the video. Over to the side, peeking over onto the compass because he was in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, we have Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. I wanted to put him here because the Haitian Revolution was happening at the same time as the French Revolution. Louverture was also talking about liberty, just like the revolutionaries back in France, but it would take the revolution until 1794 for Robespierre and the other revolutionaries on top at the time to actually get around to abolishing slavery. This didn't last for too long, though. Unfortunately, Napoleon actually brought back slavery whenever he was in charge and tried but failed to recapture Haiti. The last character in this section is in the bottom right-hand corner of the quadrant, and he's representing a member of the French Directory. This is the regime that took over after Robespierre and the Mountain were kicked out of power. The Directory ruled from 1795 to 1799. After the Directory, Napoleon takes over, and really the revolutionary period of the revolution ends. The Directory was a pretty straightforward reaction to the regime under Robespierre and the Mountain. They were anti-terror and basically tried to consolidate some of the gains from the revolution. They had some success, but ultimately this regime was pretty corrupt and constantly relying on the military rather than on popular support in order to maintain control. The fact that this was the case made them very susceptible to a coup by an enterprising young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. We'll touch on him last, though. Now, moving on to the people you've probably all been waiting for the most, your favorite radicals, the Mountain. First, we should talk a little more about the Sans-Culottes, the working class radicalized people of Paris, represented by this gentleman here. The Sans-Culottes wanted social equality, but they were also pushing the revolutionary government to do something about the economic conditions for the lower classes, which sometimes put them at odds with the more philosophically inclined leaders of the revolution. They were also very influenced by radical publishers like Jacobins, who was constantly pushing the revolutionary government to go farther and faster with things like the Reign of Terror, with de-Christianization, with basically everything. They're known for their political positions, but also for their willingness to back up their talk with heads on pikes. In September of 1792, when the monarchist armies were advancing on Paris, the Sans-Culottes, as well as other revolutionaries in Paris, started to become especially paranoid about the enemy within and carried out what's known to history as the September massacres. Prisons were taken over and suspected enemies of the revolution were summarily executed. From what I've read, the Sans-Culottes as a distinct political force really declined after Jacobins was guillotined on the orders of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. As best I can tell, he personally didn't have any last words and was basically just screaming. Now, finally, let's talk about Robespierre. Robespierre, like many revolutionaries throughout history, got his start as a lawyer. He was at the original Estates General and made a name for himself in the early revolution, but where he really rises to prominence is as a leader of the Jacobin Club, and especially after the king's flight to Varennes. The Jacobin Club is hard to categorize ideologically by modern standards because their kind of ideology isn't super prevalent anymore. It certainly wasn't conservatism, but it also wasn't really socialism either. It's certainly not the kind of Karl Marx type socialism that most people think of whenever they hear the word socialism. Robespierre believed in private property, for example, and Karl Marx wasn't born until 20 years after the fall of the Bastille. So if they weren't socialists and they weren't conservatives, were they liberals? Well, kind of. I think the thing that confuses the classification of the Jacobins is that they often had liberal ends in mind. Robespierre popularized the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity, for example, but the Jacobins were also willing to do a whole lot of authoritarian stuff on their road to their ideal constitutional republic. Like I said, they're kind of hard to classify by modern ideological standards. But anyway, Robespierre was a leader of the Mountain. He was willing to explicitly call for the king's death when the Girondins would not. He also opposed declaring war on Austria, something the Girondins supported, which helped Robespierre's popularity when the war wasn't going so well. Robespierre was also able to generate support for the Mountain among the Sans-Culottes by supporting price controls on food. I've talked a lot about Robespierre and the things that he did throughout this video, but it's also impossible to understand what this means without understanding the way that he was able to actually exercise power through the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was created when everything seemed to be in crisis for the revolution. War, revolt, fear of traitors, all of it. Originally, it was dominated by Georges Danton, who I'll get to in a little bit, but it came to be dominated by Maximilien Robespierre. The committee was basically the executive authority of the revolutionary government during this time. It was an emergency powers type situation. It was able to approve lists of people to be arrested, and because the trials at this stage of the revolution weren't exactly free and fair, especially for political people, the Committee of Public Safety was effectively able to purge opponents at will, which it did multiple times under the leadership of Robespierre. The era roughly between when the Girondins were purged and when Robespierre is overthrown in an event called the Thermidorian Reaction is the period that we know as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror isn't just something that we use to describe this period now, though. Robespierre was using the word terror. Here's a section from one of his speeches talking about what he means whenever he talks about why terror is good. If the spring of popular government in time of peace is virtue, the springs of popular government in revolution are at once virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is fatal, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is not so much a special principle as it is a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most urgent needs. It has been said that terror is the principle of despotic government. Does your government therefore resemble despotism? Yes. As the sword that gleams in the hands of heroes of liberty resembles that with which the henchmen of tyranny are armed. Let the despot govern by terror his brutalized subjects, and he is right as a despot. Subdue by terror the enemies of liberty, and you will be right as founders of the republic. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny, is force made only to protect crime, and is the thunderbolt not destined to strike the heads of the proud. Indulgence for the royalists, cry certain men. Mercy for the villains. No, mercy for the innocent. Mercy for the weak. Mercy for the unfortunate. Mercy for humanity. So you can start to see how the Reign of Terror ended up being justified by Robespierre and others, right? But of course, the Committee of Public Safety wasn't just Robespierre. It had 12 members, and there was another important committee, the Committee of General Security, which supported the terror, but was also eventually instrumental in Robespierre's overthrow. This is something that often gets lost. While Robespierre was the dominant voice for a good long time in French politics, he wasn't the only person supporting the Reign of Terror. One of Robespierre's closest allies, Saint-Just, who I have right behind Robespierre here, was called the Archangel of Terror, just as an example. Saint-Just burst onto the political scene with a speech declaring that the king needed to be immediately executed. He said that there was no middle ground between monarchy and the revolution. The king must reign or die. One famous quote from him that I think captures the mindset not just of Saint-Just, but of a lot of the radical Jacobins is this: those who make revolutions by halves do nothing but dig their own graves. Another one of Robespierre's greatest hits that you might have heard of is the cult of the supreme being. Robespierre introduced this religion as a republican virtue inculcating alternative to Christianity. It was Robespierre's way of trying to do a sort of half turn away from some of the radicals that wanted to see all of religion totally stamped out across France. The religious context of France before and during the revolution is something that I feel like would take a whole other video to explain, just because it's so alien to the modern American context. The church before the revolution in France was intermingled with the state. The church had the power to tax, and the Pope owned a little enclave inside of France. Robespierre's fall occurred during the Thermidorian reaction, so-called because it occurred during the month of Thermidor on the French revolutionary calendar. Yes, they did change the calendar, and they made year one start in 1789, just to give you an idea of the revolutionary mindset. But I digress. Robespierre eventually inspired so much terror in the other revolutionaries that they shouted him down in the convention and voted to have him and several of his allies arrested. This kicked off a fight across Paris between forces loyal to Robespierre and forces loyal to the convention. Robespierre and his allies ended up trapped, and they were eventually arrested. Robespierre didn't have much in the way of last words before the guillotine, since he shattered his jaw trying to take matters into his own hands when he saw the situation was hopeless. Saint-Just, on the other hand, according to contemporary accounts, was weirdly stoic and didn't say anything. The Jacobins weren't the only political club in revolutionary Paris. The Courtelis Club was another political club known for its populism and association with radical journalists like Desmoulins and Marat. They had a more working class character than the Jacobins, who had a kind of intellectual vibe sometimes. Another member of the Courtelis Club was Georges Danton, who was one of the greatest speakers of the French Revolution. He was known for his booming voice. Like all great French revolutionaries, he had a nickname. Robespierre was called the Incorruptible. Danton was called the Thunderer. Danton was sort of sandwiched between the radical Jacobins and the Girondins. He sometimes worked with both, but also sometimes irritated both. In contrast to many other revolutionaries, Danton seems to have become slightly more moderate throughout the revolution, or at least felt the ground shifting underneath him a little bit. Even though he was at this point no longer working with the Girondins, he was sad whenever they were purged. He opposed the Reign of Terror and was critical of Robespierre. This ended up putting Danton in the position of playing the moderate opposition politician, which I'm sure was a very weird and uncomfortable position for him, since he had been so instrumental in so many of the popular uprisings and movements during the revolution up to that point. His opposition to Robespierre's policies would eventually lead him to the guillotine. He has the best last words in the French Revolution. He said, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Above Danton, we have the famous painting of Jean-Paul Marat. You might recognize this painting from that Have a Nice Life album cover. Marat was a radical journalist. He is emblematic of the kind of radical journalism that was motivating the population of Paris during the more extreme phases of the revolution. I feel like you can probably imagine the gist of what Marat was about at this point: merciless attacks on the aristocracy, alleged counter-revolutionaries, and even revolutionaries that were too moderate for his liking. He's probably most famous today, at least compared to other radical journalists that were doing similar things at the time, because he was assassinated by a young woman named Charlotte Corday. She was aligned with the Girondins. She snuck into Marat's room by claiming she had information on Girondins that had fled to the countryside, and then she stabbed him in the bathtub that he was in all the time because he had a skin condition. This turned him into something of a revolutionary martyr, and he was given a huge funeral, and his painting by Jacques-Louis David was commissioned in order basically to immortalize him. One last character before Napoleon, I wanted to include him just because he's the closest that the French Revolution got to actual socialism, as opposed to the sort of classical radicalism, Rousseauist revolutionary state stuff that Robespierre and company were up to. This is Gracchus Babeuf. Gracchus wasn't his real name. His actual name was Francois Noël, but he was called Gracchus in reference to the Gracchi brothers of ancient Rome, who wanted to do land redistribution. He wanted the revolution to go further than the Jacobins like Robespierre were willing to go in the name of equality. He wanted to do things like abolish private property, for example. He tried to carry out his proto-socialist revolution with something called the conspiracy of the equals, but was arrested and executed by the regime that came after Robespierre was toppled. He's an interesting character, but he's probably most relevant just because he inspired later socialists, which is why he's sort of half on, half off the chart here. Finally, our last character, Napoleon Bonaparte. Obviously, the life of Napoleon could get its own entire video series, but I just wanted to touch on a few key things. He was able to rise through the ranks as an officer because of the more merit-based system that the revolution created. His status as a war hero made him incredibly popular in France, and that's why Abbe Siyes, if you remember him from the beginning of the video, looked to Napoleon as an ideal sword to lead a coup against the French Directory. The idea by Siyes was that he would actually take over with Napoleon's help and redesign the Constitution. Of course, this is not actually what happened. Abbe Siyes was totally outmaneuvered and sidelined by Napoleon. After Napoleon took power, he did consolidate some of the gains of the revolution with the Napoleonic Code, for example, but he was also a dictator that rolled back women's rights and brought back slavery. He was also famously unafraid to give protesters a whiff of grape shot. He also made himself emperor, which I think is just about as good a place as any to call the revolution finished. That was a wild ride. I really hope you learned a lot about the French Revolution in this video. Let me know who your favorite character was that I mentioned, and of course, let me know who I left off. I was really only scratching the surface here. It's such an interesting period of history, and you just can't do it justice in one YouTube video. Thank you so much to my channel members. Become a channel member to get your name in the credits of my future videos. I'll see you next time.